Okay, this is going to be a progress report of such, and it's also going to report kind of a number of transactions that took place in and around a classroom. And it starts, I guess, from the idea of something that Dr. Matthews said about what is a university. You know, and a university is where you learn stuff, supposedly. And I want to talk about the ways that you tangentially learn stuff outside of just the lecture itself. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about something called the public sphere. And something that's bothered me for a long time, and I adopted a particular rhetorical position to stir things up. In other words, I don't necessarily believe what I say is a way to go, but it interests me enough that I want to discuss it. And what I mean by that is I believe that intelligent design, in the broadest sense, and the idea that maybe the creator is the guy or woman or goddess who turns the switch on to everything, should be taught with some sort of curricular respect and not simply dismissed as a crazy sort of out of fashion idea. And the reason I'm doing that is because I had a brief conversation with Dr. Matthews after class, and it's a big class, 140 people, and I sit way in the back, but he is attuned to a lot of things. He performs sort of like Robin Williams when he's lecturing. I think he may have done a cartwheel at least once or twice, which is pretty good for a 50-year-old ex-rugby player. But when I told my friend Mike, who I'm trying to get actually to work on my projects, because he has certain podcasting skills that will be very useful to me, and to get him to be useful to me, I have to engage him. But to engage him, I've got to not just let him talk and talk about the only thing that he's interested in. And he's designed a kind of game using open source software, which allows him to create something that's sort of like an evolutionary competition between different species. And the people that win are the ones whose phenotype multiplies the most successfully. And so what it really is kind of a Darwinian view of evolution, and it gets reduced really quickly to survival of the fittest. And I said, well, I was sitting talking with him after class about this, and I said, well, my problem with what you're assuming is the idea of the survival of the fittest is really become so melded in with multinational capitalism that you assume that anything that happens, like closing a university, you'll say, well, if a university ain't making money, it's like a business and we close it down. Well, that's an ideology for going back to the way it used to be, when nobody could go to a university except the richest people, and it makes no account for social good. And in a sense, people will pick up Darwinian evolution and interpret it so it becomes what you call an ideology. And just as I was saying this, Professor Matthews caught that particular position because he's a theistic Christian, and said he too found that interesting. So since Mike was so sure of what he thought to be true, I figured I'd rough him up a little bit intellectually. And in the process of doing that, we were talking about cellular biology, and he was using a particular term, I guess it's called a bias random walk. And a random walk is a statistical way of describing unpurposeful movement. And the word bias is added to that. Now, way back when I went to a great university as an undergraduate, you weren't allowed to use bias and random in the same sentence, because that would be a contradiction in terms. Well, the more I talked to him, the more my brain hurt, because he wasn't giving ground and we didn't appear to be listening to each other. At that particular point, a math professor, who I've probably said hello to for 20 years, came walking by, and I said, "Hey, come here. I want you to explain how you can have a biased random walk and do it in a way that I can understand it." So we talked for a while, and Mike gave me this paper he wanted me to read, which again made my head hurt, but I read it. So I forwarded it to my math professor's friend. And what I'm saying is that we want to have is people with different perspectives dialoguing. And I will say that it's kind of a thing where people will say, as you'll say with Christianity, well, they didn't mean that. They didn't mean the Inquisition. They didn't mean all the horrible things that missionaries did. They meant something else, and we're going to factor it out. And people will say the same thing about multinational capitalism. Well, no, we don't mean that. We mean it in an abstract way. And if there are specific counterexamples, we're just going to forget about them. If you look at the economy of China, you can say, well, lots of people were lifted out of poverty. But as the population doubled in my lifetime or greater, there's a lot more Chinese living in poverty now than there was when I was a 19-year-old. Well, so what do you say about that then? Well, before you use China or anything else as a model, you sort of have to discuss it. And that's the kind of thing that I want to do. And that's the kind of thing that I talk to smart young people for. And then those are the reasons that I might go to the internet and listen to world experts talk about bias, random walks, and cellular biology, and organelles which contain a part of the cells. And in the process then ask a PhD candidate named Austin, who's one of my colleagues out at Cal Riverside, well, just what is social psychology? He's getting his PhD in it. And it turns out some of its formulations are going to be exceedingly useful in a book of essays that I want to edit on the American writer Ralph Ellison. And it turns out that concepts which I had used in other instances could now be explained in a social psychological way that might give me an insight into my topic from a literary standpoint. One of the simplest ones, it turns out that social psychology sort of grew up in the post-World War II experience because people wondered how the terrible things that were done in the name of countries, in the name of religion, in the name of ideology could have been done by people who had ethical systems. And one of the ways that psychology would look at that is to just sort of watch their behavior, do experiments, the Milgram experiment where experimenters gave experimental subjects what they thought were fatal electrical shocks, following orders, accepting authority. Or the Stanford prison experiment, which I'm just reading about now, which did the same sort of thing, and it turned out that if you took a group and split it in half being guards and half being prisoners, they behaved in the worst way possible, even the experimental designer. Well, bingo. What that got me thinking about is I've studied science fiction, read it my whole life, and suddenly I see evidence of the leading social science experiments manifesting themselves in the work of Samuel Delaney, who was sort of a friend of mine and waiting for me to write more on this, the late Ursula K. Le Guin, and several others who took psychological research and made science fiction contemporary, relevant, and about our lives, and projecting possible futures which we might have come to live through. Now, one of the things, of course, I think about is I happen to be Vietnam era. My first bunch of education took place at that time, and the passivity of students now just is, to me, amazing, considering what is at stake, you know, and how much education costs, and how we've on a policy level been reduced almost to a TaskRabbit economy. So you will never hear me say, boy, do the kids now expect anything. I will say, boy, it's a rough track. It is a tough deal. There was a time, again, when many of us started, when you could actually pay for your education with a summer job. Now, even a degree at UW-Eau Claire, I suspect if you were to borrow the whole cost, would cost probably $50,000 or $60,000. So I guess what I'm saying is that I picked up a great deal from my conversation with Michael. It allowed me to follow some things down. I even solved a problem in a conversation with my wife, who does STEM education prep on an international level. I was having problems with an introductory course in neurobiology. It's a psychology course, but it's really neurobiology. And one of the terms that I wasn't getting on a test, I heard my wife read in a novel that she was teaching on, Octavia Butler, for the honors course. It had to do with the way you refer to everything that's inside a cell wall that carries on the function of a cell, which kind of turns it into a little engine. And I was able to say, well, because I had heard you say this, the phrase is organelle, and it was used in a specific literary context, I could look up the exact page and quotation on the text. Now I know what organelle means, and now I know what a lot of the other things in the course mean that I was having trouble with, because I always remember in a global kind of abstract way, and I will remember something sort of mapped in terms of something else. Now, I said, well, organelle was used in this way, and now I understand what it means. I actually hit on a couple identification questions in the test, which really saved my grade, and it was just a question of flashing a little bit through my mind, like LTP is long-term potential. This is a way of learning something and strengthening it, so that apparently if neurons fire in a particular way in close approximation to each other, you have a stronger chance of remembering something than you do if they don't. And what that also means is there's a negative part of it, so that if you learn something in an inefficient way and don't make the correction at the right time, you forget it. And so I can say now that this is me giving a talk which I'm sort of putting together, which is at least intelligible, pulling up information that I might have learned a lifetime ago, and getting some ideas for finishing a book that I've been worried about for a long, long time. So that's a pretty good report, as is the fact that I've continued on my weight loss program with the Kaveny paradox. So we'd like to hear from you. We'd like your review books. We'd like your comments. And I feel really good today with my new red shirt and clean living room and a bunch of other things.